Tom was an experienced outdoorsman in his 50s, a dedicated camper and fisherman who often sought solitude by the lake he loved. This remote, tranquil spot had been his personal refuge for years, and he always came well prepared. His truck held everything he needed for his week-long trips: bushcraft kits, tools, fishing gear, and plenty of food. Over the years, he'd learned every corner of the lake, each sound in the woods. It was a place of peace where he never expected anything unusual. As he arrived, Tom set up camp with the practiced skill of a seasoned camper. He pitched his tent, set up his fishing lines, and got a fire going. The lake was quiet, the water reflecting the clear sky above. But that night, as he lay under the stars, something felt different. The forest's usual calm had an odd, heavy stillness to it, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, though he saw no sign of anything around him. The second night brought something even stranger. He found unusual scratches on trees near his camp, claw marks that looked too large for any animal he knew. In the muddy shorelines, deep footprints were visible, larger and wider than any he had ever seen. Tom tried to explain it to himself as a bear, or maybe a large animal he wasn't familiar with. But deep down he felt unsettled, as if there was something more to it. During the day he stayed vigilant, keeping an eye on the woods and the water. As dusk fell, though, his sense of unease only grew. Odd, low rustling sounds began echoing through the forest, getting louder as the night darkened. He couldn't place the source, and every instinct told him to stay near the fire, to keep it burning. A strange tension settled over him, one he hadn't felt in all his years at the lake. That night Tom barely slept. The unfamiliar sounds continued, closer and louder, like a low growl mixed with the rustle of leaves. Just as he began to drift off, a shadow moved through the trees. Startled, he sat up, gripping his flashlight. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, but then he saw it, a large, shadowy figure moving stealthily, watching him from a distance. Its shape was vaguely human, but wrong, distorted. In the dim firelight, he caught a brief glimpse of the creature. It was humanoid, but not quite human, with elongated limbs and a thin, pale form that seemed almost skeletal. It moved with an unsettling silence, watching him with empty eyes. For a moment, Tom's heart froze. The creature seemed to be studying him, as if assessing whether he was prey. When it took a step forward, he grabbed his axe, prepared to defend himself if needed. He knew running was useless. Summoning every ounce of courage, he waited until the creature was close before he swung the axe. But the creature was faster than he'd anticipated, dodging with surprising agility. Tom felt a rush of adrenaline as the creature circled him, and he knew he had to rely on his survival skills to outwit it. A tense struggle followed. Tom moved carefully, using every bit of his experience to avoid the creature's grasp. Desperation filled him as he swung his axe, barely missing the creature as it evaded him again. He quickly gathered some dry branches, lighting them to create a torch. The creature recoiled from the fire, snarling quietly, and slipped back into the darkness, leaving Tom tense but alive. He knew it hadn't retreated for long. At dawn, he examined the area around his camp. Scratches and disturbed earth marked where they had fought, and he knew the creature would return. Determined to survive, he spent the day reinforcing his campsite, creating barriers from branches and rocks. He sharpened his tools and mentally prepared for another encounter, knowing he'd need every advantage to make it through the night. When night fell, an eerie silence settled over the lake. Tom stayed by his fire, his axe in hand, surrounded by makeshift barricades and torches. As he waited, the familiar rustling began, and he saw the creature's shadow lurking among the trees. This time, he was ready. He stood his ground, every muscle tensed, prepared for whatever came next. The creature stepped into the firelight, its hollow eyes fixed on him. They faced each other in a tense standoff, and Tom's hand tightened on his axe. The creature took a step closer, and Tom lunged forward, using the fire to keep it at bay. He was careful, deliberate in his movements, forcing it toward a trap he had prepared. He had sharpened sticks and positioned them where the creature would least expect. As he drew the creature closer, he sprang his trap, forcing it into the sharp branches. The creature let out a low, guttural noise, struggling against the barrier. Tom watched as the creature struggled, its form finally weakening. With one last look, it retreated into the woods, leaving a faint trail in its wake. He let out a long breath, knowing the danger had finally passed. The lake was silent again as dawn broke, and Tom knew he had won. Exhausted but relieved, he broke down his camp, feeling the weight of the experience settle over him. He glanced at the lake one last time, his familiar place now forever changed. The creature was gone, but he could still feel its presence, as if the lake held secrets he could never understand. As he drove away, Tom resolved never to return. The lake had been his sanctuary, a place he thought he knew. But now he understood that some places hid things better left undiscovered, and some battles left marks that would never fully fade. Jack was an experienced fisherman, a man in his 50s who spent most of his days by the edge of a quiet, secluded lake surrounded by dense forest. For years, this place had been his sanctuary, a space of peace and solitude. He knew every curve and sound of the lake and took pride in the pristine trout and fish he caught. The lake had always been generous, and he never imagined that anything dark could linger beneath its calm surface. But recently things started to change. The once clear and bountiful lake felt different. The fish he pulled up had become scarce, and those he did catch seemed sickly. Some had eyes streaked with blood, while others were oddly bloated or twisted in strange shapes. Even stranger, the dead fish sank instead of floating, a sight that disturbed Jack more than he could admit. Each day seemed to bring new signs that the lake was no longer the haven it once was. He noticed bubbles rising in patches, swirling on the surface without any apparent cause. The sight of them sent chills down his spine, and it wasn't just Jack who sensed the change. Animals that usually drank from the lake's edge began to avoid it, skittering away nervously whenever they neared the water. One evening, Jack saw a stain of dark red floating near his boat. He leaned over, squinting at the unsettling sight as the sunlight faded. The water seemed to carry the faintest metallic scent, and though he tried to convince himself it was nothing, a part of him knew something was deeply wrong. He told no one about what he'd seen, partly out of denial and partly because he feared no one would believe him. As the weeks passed, Jack's sense of unease grew stronger. The lake seemed to pulse with a strange energy, an almost unnatural pull. Sometimes he thought he saw fleeting shadows beneath the surface, but whenever he tried to focus, the shapes would vanish. He found himself staring into the water for hours, as if searching for something he couldn't name. One night, Jack was jolted awake by a dream. In it, he'd seen a small figure standing on the edge of the lake, watching him in silence. It was a young girl with pale skin and a dark dress clinging to her body as if soaked. Her eyes were empty, cold, and seemed to pierce him from within his mind. He woke up drenched in sweat, unable to shake the vision from his mind. The next day, he returned to the lake, but now a heavy feeling weighed on him. As he cast his line, he couldn't stop thinking about the girl from his dream. The bubbles reappeared on the water's surface, forming in odd patterns, and he felt as if something was lurking just out of sight, hidden beneath the calm ripples. Jack gripped his fishing rod tightly, trying to push away the fear. Hours passed in tense silence. Jack pulled up a fish, only to see its body riddled with strange wounds. The smell was unbearable, and he tossed it back, repulsed. He noticed more red stains in the water, faint but unmistakable. The sense of dread deepened, and he felt as if the lake itself was watching him, waiting for something. Then, as dusk began to settle, Jack heard a faint giggle echo across the lake, chilling him to the bone. He looked around, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The sound was light, almost playful, yet there was something sinister woven into it. He told himself it was just the wind, but deep down he knew better. He began to pack up his gear, unable to shake the feeling that he was no longer alone. Just as he was about to leave, Jack noticed a faint shape emerging from the center of the lake. A small head, dripping with water, broke the surface, followed by the delicate features of a young girl. Her skin was ghostly pale, and her dark hair clung to her face. She was just like the figure from his dream. Jack's breath caught, and he froze, watching in horror as she began to drift closer. The girl's eyes met his, and they were empty, hollow pools that seemed to pull him in. She was smiling, But it wasn't a child's innocent grin. It was twisted, almost mocking. Jack felt rooted in place, unable to look away. He tried to convince himself it was a hallucination, but her gaze felt all too real, cutting through him with an icy, unnatural focus. The water around her started bubbling, red swirls forming beneath her. Jack's heart raced as he stumbled back, almost tripping over his own feet. He could feel her eyes on him, watching every step. The lake that had once been his sanctuary had become a place of terror, and he finally understood that he had to get away. Yet something held him there, as if an invisible force bound him. Suddenly she lifted a small pale hand from the water, her fingers thin and wrinkled as if decayed. Jack felt a surge of panic as he realized she was gesturing for him to come closer. The lake seemed to darken, the air thickening around him, and he heard that eerie giggle again, softer but closer this time. The girl's hand remained raised, waiting, her smile widening. He managed to tear his gaze away, but the image of her pale face lingered in his mind. Jack grabbed his fishing rod and began to run, his boots thudding against the muddy ground as he tried to escape. But even as he fled, he could feel her presence, as if she were still watching him, laughing silently as he stumbled through the trees. By the time he reached his truck, his hands were shaking. He looked back at the lake one last time, hoping she was gone. But there she was, still floating in the center, watching him with that haunting smile. He drove away, promising himself he'd never return. Yet the image of the girl remained, etched deeply into his memory. Days turned into weeks, but Jack couldn't escape the nightmares that plagued him. Every night, he saw her standing by his bedside, dripping lake water, her cold, hollow eyes never leaving his. He had seen many things in his life, but nothing like her. She was a part of the lake, an ancient malevolent force that he had somehow disturbed. No one believed him when he tried to explain what he'd seen. They laughed, dismissing it as an old man's fantasy, a story fit for a campfire. But Jack knew the truth. The lake had changed, and the girl would remain, haunting its waters, waiting for the next person who dared to disturb her eternal rest. Dan was an avid fisherman who spent countless hours by the lake just outside his small town. One quiet afternoon, as he was reeling in his line, he felt an unusual weight tugging back. Expecting a big catch, he carefully reeled in his line, only to find something unexpected. A small, dark object about the size of his palm. It looked like a strange stone with intricate carvings, unlike anything he'd ever seen in his years by the lake. Curious, Dan examined the artifact more closely. It seemed ancient, the carvings oddly mesmerizing. He turned it over, looking for clues about its origin, but he found nothing recognizable. As he ran his fingers over the carved lines, the stone shifted slightly, almost like a latch was coming undone. Before he knew it, the artifact snapped open, releasing a dark mist that seemed to surround him. In a matter of seconds, Dan felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. His vision blurred, and an eerie sensation gripped his mind. It was as though something dark and powerful had taken hold of him. He tried to shake it off, but the feeling only grew stronger. His thoughts became jumbled, foreign, and a chilling voice echoed inside his head, whispering commands he couldn't resist. Under the influence of this newfound presence, Dan returned to his small town, but he was no longer the same man. His movements were rigid, his eyes glazed with a strange, dark energy. The townspeople noticed his odd behavior but dismissed it, assuming he was tired from a long day. But as night fell, the true terror began to unfold. The first family to encounter Dan's new form was the Millers, who lived at the end of the street. They'd known him for years, but when he appeared on their doorstep with a vacant, unsettling stare, they grew uneasy. He didn't speak, just stood there in silence. Before they could react, a wave of malice surged, and the darkness within him overtook the household. As dawn broke, the town was shaken by whispers of what had happened to the Millers. But Dan, still possessed, felt nothing. The entity controlling him grew stronger with each encounter, feeding off fear and chaos. The next night, he moved to another home, repeating the same terrifying cycle. With every act, the dark force within him grew bolder, his grip on his own mind slipping further. Each morning, the townspeople found new signs of the unnatural presence. Doors were left ajar, lights flickered, and an uneasy feeling permeated the air. Those who encountered Dan noticed his change. His once friendly demeanor had turned cold, detached, but his eyes held an intensity, a dark energy that warned others to stay away. By the fourth night, the town was in a quiet state of panic. Families began locking their doors, whispering of the strange things happening. But Dan, driven by the entity within, seemed unstoppable. The next family fell victim to his unrelenting presence, their home left in silence by morning, with no sign of what had occurred within its walls. Dan's mind, still trapped within, fought to regain control, but the demon's hold was unbreakable. Every attempt to resist was met with overpowering darkness, his own thoughts drowned out by the relentless whispers that urged him onward. Each act of destruction only fed the malevolent force, binding him tighter to its will. The townspeople's fear escalated, and they turned to each other for protection. But Dan was relentless, the entity using his knowledge of the town's layout and residents to its advantage. He moved like a shadow, appearing when least expected, his presence a harbinger of doom that left no room for escape. By the sixth night, Dan's own family grew concerned, noticing his absence from home and his unusual behavior. But when they sought to confront him, they faced a man they no longer recognized. The look in his eyes was void, his voice twisted with malice. They realized too late that the Dan they knew was gone, replaced by something sinister. In one final act of resistance, Dan's spirit fought against the entity, desperate to protect his own loved ones. But his struggle was brief. The demon's grip tightened, silencing his cries. The darkness surged, and he was forced to act, his body moving against his will, leaving his family in stunned horror. As dawn approached, the town was left in ruin, shattered by the unrelenting terror of Dan's actions. The dark energy had consumed him completely, leaving no trace of the man he once was. The lake that had once been his place of peace now seemed cursed, as if it harbored secrets that had long waited to be unearthed. With the demon's thirst for chaos momentarily sated, it released its hold on Dan's mind. For a brief moment, he was aware of his surroundings, horrified at the destruction around him. The realization of what he had done weighed heavily, and a deep despair took root. But the damage was done, and he knew he could never undo what had transpired. In his final moments, Dan returned to the lake, seeking the only peace he could find. The artifact lay on the shore, its surface dark and foreboding. He knew it was the source, but the thought of touching it again was unbearable. As he stared into the water, the whispers faded, leaving him alone with the memories of the nightmare he had unleashed. The lake grew silent as he disappeared into the trees, leaving the artifact behind. The townspeople, reeling from the horror, vowed never to return to the lake. They left the artifact undisturbed, its dark presence buried within, waiting for the next soul curious enough to awaken it.